2013, but there's more to come. And just very briefly, a bit of my background, I've been in the energy sector since the end of last century. I can certainly say that. 1999 I started, worked for some of the major participants. More recently, I've been appointed to the National Code of Conduct for the Energy Council, the Energy Charter, as a council member for that group, trying to also look at tidying up the industry generally. And about half my time in the energy markets has been involved with embedded networks, establishing, managing, advising, converting, and the whole sort of segment from woe to go. And so had a broad experience in that area. So Megan mentioned about asking questions. So certainly at the end, we'll have a big chunk of time where we're going to be going through a Q&A session from pre-asked questions plus anything else that might come up. But because it's quite a longish presentation and some of it might be a bit technical in nature, please feel free to jump in. As Megan said, raise the hand function. If I don't see the hand raised, please Megan or someone could just identify that hand's been raised, and let's just ask questions to go along as well. If it starts to be too many questions, then we might just slow that down. We'll see how we go. So what's an embedded network? In the most sort of fundamental sense, it's a private electricity network that serves multiple residential customers. So it's not grid connected for all the individual customers, it's a private network. Typical buildings, as we're focusing on residential apartments today, but absolutely common in shopping centres, commercial buildings, retirement villages, airports, any sort of multi-tenanted or multi-occupanted building. The private networks are located within a distribution network or potentially even a transmission network, the high voltage networks. And Ausgrid is where the City of Sydney, most of their distribution zone is, and the rest of the two other zones in New South Wales are Endeavour Energy and Essential Energy. Now all the energy is aggregated to a single parent meter, and we'll definitely dig into this in a little bit more detail down the track. And embedded network utilities, such as electricity, centralised hot water, very common in most new developments, and even private fibre networks, the internet services within the building. And we're only really touching on that today. Our main focus is electricity, a little bit on centralised hot water, and then we'll just touch very briefly on fibre. So I mentioned the parent meter measures the energy for the whole site. Child metering measures the energy for individual customers, and we'll go through that in more detail shortly. A lot of regulatory compliance requirements, certainly with electricity. And just in these two examples here, this is sort of a bit of a pictorial description of what the embedded networks look like. With the electricity network on the side, by the way, I borrowed these images thanks to the Ombudsman in Victoria and Origin Energy's hot water from their website there. So with electricity in particular, you see the square box in the centre of the screen, that's what was called the parent meter. And then downstream of that parent meter, it is the private network, and then the individual apartments or lots are all measured individually. And of course, there's the distribution network and the transmission networks that I was talking about that it sits within. So how do they work? Like, how do the embedded networks actually work? So the infrastructure that's in the building, such as the main switchboard, for electricity, the distribution, the metering boards, or the distribution boards, even with a hot water reticulation system throughout the building, that's the traditional infrastructure that's in the building. Whether it's an embedded network or not, it's identical the way that this is set up. So in relation to electricity, I mentioned the parent meter. So a little bit of extra infrastructure is required to house the parent meter, a new distribution board, for example. And if it's a CT metering, current transformer metering, it'll need a CT chamber there to comply with the service installation rules for the local distribution networks. Not significant extra costs, could be 10 or 15 or 20 or even $30,000 extra, depending on the size of the building, but it's not in the hundreds of thousands of dollars of extra costs for the creation of that. I mentioned the parent meter aggregates the energy to the central point. That obviously creates a bulk buying opportunity. So when the building or the managing operator of the building purchases energy for the whole site, they're buying energy as a large market customer, and they sell energy to small market customers. So those definitions of large and small are capital letters on purpose because it's a definition of the electricity market, and I will explore that a bit further as the presentation progresses. The child metering not only measures the energy that's being used, but also facilitates billing to the occupants and also to the common area as well. So this whole buy-sell arbitrage process, creates extra revenue, extra funds, and those funds can be profits for the embedded network operator, can be shared benefits with the owners corporation, or discounts, obviously, to the residents or shopping centre tenants. So how customers billed? So energy bills should reflect the market. Megan touched on NECF, the National Energy Customer Framework, and there's certainly other regulatory requirements as well that energy bills need to mirror with inside embedded networks what they would be in the energy market. But all billing practices are not necessarily occurring in that manner. So we talked about small customers before. Different state jurisdictions have different lines in the sand, but in New South Wales, 100,000 kilowatt hours or 100 megawatt hours per annum is the line in the sand for a large small market customer. So the average residential apartment is sort of 2 to 5 megawatt hours. So obviously well and truly within that small market zone. Tariffs that customers inside embedded networks must shadow the market. Those rules have been around since the beginning. A lot more clarity was provided in December 2017, and also more clarity again coming with the new regulations. But they must shadow the market tariff, so a customer can't be charged more, a small market customer, than they would have been charged if they were grid connected. So in New South Wales, the published tariffs are now called direct market offers. That started a couple of years ago with the new style of regulated tariffs. Greater consumer protections for small market customers because regulators don't focus so much on large market, but certainly small markets. All the normal consumer protections you'd expect should be there, or hopefully be there. And different styles of billing. So small market customers are billed in a bundled manner versus large market unbundled. In the next slide, we'll look at some examples to that. So large market customers, again, over 100,000 kilowatt hours per annum, significantly less consumer protections, and traditionally large market customers are billed in an unbundled fashion. So one thing I just wanted to highlight, the Owners Corporation's common area account is actually a customer too inside the embedded network. So even if they are managing the embedded network themselves, which we'll talk about that also shortly, they are a customer inside the embedded network. They can be a small or large market customer, it depends on the energy consumption. Billing practices for the common area Owners Corporation's account don't always follow the market processes or general trends or general protocols. I've seen many examples where you have a large energy consumption that's billed as a small market customer in a bundled tariff. So there's no transparency. So let's just jump onto the next slide. So this is a great example. This is an embedded network bill. I obviously blanked out all the site-specific stuff, but this is a traditional way large market energy bills are presented. You've got the energy charges, which is the commodity component, the actual energy that the customer uses. Some administrative charges from the market regulators, environmental charges, they're compulsory environmental charges as opposed to green power. The network charges are the physical distribution charges for the physical supply of energy, and plus metering charges as well. This is a very, very typical large market energy bill. You even note that the network charge code is there, it's EA310, so we know that's Ausgrid's network area, it's in the 310 network tariff code. So this is a large market customer. This is another example of embedded network bill, also a large market customer. This is only one bill, but the actual load for this site was about 120 or 130,000 kilowatt hours per annum, so well and truly across that line in the sand. But this is a bundled bill, so you see an energy rate, the total delivered energy cost, and you see a daily fee, and that's it. There's no transparency into any of the detail or the attributes of that billing customer. And if, for example, from an energy management perspective, if you had unbundled billing and you notice that you're on a kilowatt or a kVA distribution tariff where there's a charge there associated with that, you have no insight into try to determine where you may be able to apply some energy efficiency measures into the building to help reduce your charges. So if anyone knows anyone who's in embedded network bundled billing, I would certainly encourage them to talk to the embedded network operator to request unbundled billing if they're a large market load. So choice, very controversial part of our discussion now, choice. So electricity customers can approach energy retailers and ask for an energy-only offer. They're not asking for a fully delivered energy cost at this stage, it's asking just for an energy-only offer. And if you just, I'll go backwards a couple of steps. If you see this bill example here, the energy charges, the peak, shoulder, off-peak, that's the component we're talking about now in this one. Once a customer signs a contract with an energy retailer, the energy retailer will approach the market participant called the embedded network manager. So that's not the person operating or managing the site, it's a market participant role called an E&M. They would request a NIMI, a national meter identifier, to be activated for that customer, potentially change metering if it's private metering, not market metering, and then a transfer process established in a market system called MSATs. It's a market administration system. So in these scenarios, customers are most likely going to end up with the dual bill scenario, i.e. the first bill is the energy retailer's charges, so the energy, the metering, the environmental charges would all be associated with the energy retailer, and then a separate bill from the physical distribution charges, which is the embedded network operator paying for all the costs for the distribution charges at the gate meter or at the parent meter, and then they're recovering those costs from the individual tenants inside that building. So those charges must mirror whatever the distribution charges would have been for that customer if they were a market customer. You could ask the energy retailer to negotiate with the embedded network operator to consolidate all the details into one bill, so there's no two bill scenario. But could be a difficult conversation to have because the retailers aren't on board with the program yet. But we will explore that much further when we talk about rule regulations that are happening. So for centralised hot water in embedded networks, there's no choice. The embedded network operator is with the the owners corporation is with the embedded network operator that manages that site, and there's no choice for individuals to move out. Only a choice to change operators, but no choice for individuals. And in relation to private fibre, that can often be installed at the time when the building's being constructed as well. So the owners corporation has a utility arrangement with the effective utility arrangements with the network operator who owns the infrastructure, but the internet service providers are the internet retailers that the individual tenants would contract with. So depending on who the network provider is, some only have limited relationships with internet service providers. So metering, this is where it gets a bit technical now, but I'll just go through what I need to go through. Again, no hands being raised yet, so it's good. So any questions, please ask. So we talked about the parent meter before. So it's always a market meter because you're purchasing energy from an authorised retailer. It can't be a private metering, and it measures energy for the whole site. So when customers are off market inside embedded network, it means they're purchasing energy from the embedded network operator. They're not purchasing from an energy retailer outside the embedded network. And for the most part, it's private metering. It may be market metering. It depends on the appetite for the embedded network operator to install market metering from day one. But certainly, for the most part, it's private metering. So now when the customer goes on market or buying energy from an authorised retailer, as opposed to the embedded network operator, they become a market customer. Market metering needs to be installed through a metering coordinator. The NIMI, the National Meter Identifier, is published in that market administration system that I've talked about before. So the customer now becomes discoverable. And the energy that the individual customer consumes is netted out against the parent meter. So the embedded network operator, only pays for energy for the customers they're responsible for. And there's a bit of a picture of how it all displays, but I won't go through that now because people can look at the slides later. So now the contractual or the arrangements between the owners corporation and embedded network operator, we'll just touch on that for the next few slides. So the embedded network operator has a commercial arrangement with the owners corporation. that is for the management of the site. It might be for embedded network management services as well, and it certainly would cover the on-selling of electricity. From a functional point of view, the electricity meters, as we said before, measures the energy for each individual tenancy. So people are paying for their energy on a user pay basis as opposed to a lot allocation, like a lot of levy fees get sorted through. Customers do have power of choice. And the choice, again, to reiterate, also applies to the owners corporation's common area load. If they're not happy with the embedded network operator or the rates they're getting, they can go to market. Mostly they would be a large market customer, certainly in larger buildings. So it's very easy for them to depart the embedded network. So asset ownership for meters are generally owned by the embedded network operator. And as I mentioned before, they're generally private metering. Very often in new builds, especially solar, maybe even batteries, or certainly electric vehicle charging infrastructure, is all part of the new builds that often the embedded network operator will fund through a deal they've made or an arrangement they've made with the developer. So in those cases, they would most likely be owned by the embedded network operator. But as I mentioned in the very early slides, the wiring, the retriculation, the meter boards, all that infrastructure that's traditionally in a building is owned by the owners corporation. So the owners corporation actually owns the embedded network. There's certainly some embedded network operators that say they own the embedded network, but in reality, the owners corporation owns it. The only sort of variation I could see to that would be if the embedded network operator was taking a lease throughout the building for all the infrastructure. That certainly adds an extra degree of complexity, but the OC owns the embedded network, full stop. So in relation to hot water, similar to electricity, there's a commercial arrangement between the two parties, and there's two different types generally for centralised hot water. One's called bulk, one's called serviced, and the arrangement is for the selling of the hot water, of course. And often there's unmetered gas supply to like stove cooktops, those sort of things as part of that arrangement. Again, individual meters, so people are paying for the energy, are paying for their water on a user pay basis. So there are various attributes of the bill for the hot water. There's a fee for the energy that's used to heat the water up. Daily hot water service fee is almost like a connection fee, or potentially the cooktop fee if is applicable. And in a lot of scenarios, the hot water recovery or potable water recovery is also being charged the individual tenants. So what I mean by that is the water that they actually consume, not the heating factor, the water they actually consume, the cost is recovered from the tenants, and those funds have to be returned to the owners corporation. Can't make a profit on recovering Sydney water, Sydney Water's water, but however, it can be recovered. So in relation to the asset ownership, so this is where it gets a bit controversial, where traditionally, certainly infrastructure such as the hot water plant would have been owned by the owners corporation, and in the bulk hot water arrangement, that's the case. The OC owns all the hot water plant. In that display there, that little orange box on top there, that's sort of part of the hot water plant infrastructure. That's owned by the OC, and the embedded network operator would just manage that on behalf of the OC. But in the serviced hot water scenarios, the embedded network operator also owns that hot water plant. So you have a third party owning assets inside a building. Again, metering owned by the embedded network operator, and the meter reading systems, etc. And as I touched on, the water matriculation is always owned by the owners corporation. No questions? Nope. So, winners and losers. How are we going for timing? Oh, we're good on timing. So
Joseph.
Yes.
Joseph, you've got a couple of questions. So, Tonya, and I'm not sure if you want to do them now. Can you see your chat field? Tonya and John have both asked questions, and John has his hand up.
So John's question is another question. If a provider has an agreement to supply hot water and owns the hot water plant in the building, then presumably the termination under strata regulations will trigger. Okay, so yeah, so we'll touch on that a bit further down the track. However, the centralised hot water agreements between the embedded network operator and the owners corporation, they almost always, 99% of the ones I've seen, they all have termination options. And yes, there's a payout fee to do that. And I'll talk through that process down the track. Because while with electricity, there's a choice for the individuals, or theoretical choice in the market, the hot water, there's no choice, so there's an option to terminate the arrangement. So Tanya's question is market metering being updated to digital meters by the provider? Good question. I will touch on metering down the track as part of the regulatory changes, but at the moment, there's no requirement for existing embedded networks to change over metering yet. On the 1st of December 2017, there were some market changes around power of choice metering, and we'll certainly talk about that in some of the Q&A down the end as well. But in the short term, there's no requirement for meters to be changed. Down the track, there's supposed to be market metering from day one. So I've only really touched on that topic now, Tanya, so we'll dig into it a bit more later. But then if I don't answer the question completely enough, just raise your hand again and I'll go through that more. So back into this screen. Okay, so how do developers benefit? So certainly, just from a pragmatic perspective, the time and energy and cost savings, not having to go through the administration of dealing with the embedded network with the local energy distributors. And I'll give you a really sort of classic example. You've got a new development, it's 100 lots and one common area meter. So that's 101 relationships that the developer would have to have with Ausgrid or Endeavour Energy for the process of just physically getting those customers connected to the grid. So when it's an embedded network, there's one parent meter, so there's one relationship only. So just from that point of view, it's time and energy and cost savings. They'll certainly, if the embedded network operator is paying for a hot water plant, whatever costs associated with metering, solar, EV charging, etc., all those costs obviously covered by the embedded network operator that traditionally the the developer would have had to pay. The arrangements that the developer would have would be between the embedded network operator directly, some sort of embedded network establishment agreement, whatever language they would use would be different for each occasion. And certainly from the developer's perspective, if they're getting support from the embedded network operator, to get connection to the grid or providing advice around setting up a green grid or where to put the solar and this and that and the other, that's obviously advantageous for the developer. From a money perspective, I would assume from a marketing perspective, if the developer was selling the building as a sustainable building, including solar and electric vehicle charging infrastructure that's all there from day one, that for me would be an attractive building. There has been practices whereby the developers are receiving some funds from the embedded network operator, but we'll talk about that in a minute and what the AER, Australian Energy Regulator's current position is on that. And there are new operations now occurring where developers are setting up their own embedded networks from day one rather than engaging a third party. And Fraser's and Bilbergia are a couple we'll touch on in a minute. So just to dig a bit more deeply, when I talked to Megan about preparing this presentation, I said, you want to know a bit about who the players are as well. So we're touching on that sort of section now. So the business model is certainly driven by profits for the most part. All these big operators, that's obviously what they're there to do. This is just a handful of some of the operators. There are certainly many, many more out there. I touched on the developer model. So Fraser's own Real Utilities and Bilbergia own Evergy. So they've set up their own embedded network billing functions. But in Energy Australia, the scene there is Energy Australia, obviously Origin are there. So significant players starting to get into the embedded network space too. This is by no means a complete list. There's another dozen or 2 dozen operators out there as well. So to keep going down this path of the commerciality of it, Wind Connect was sold to Pacific Equity Partners end of 2019, for $100 million. OC Energy sold their business to Origin for 60 or 65 million, something like that. Just from memory, that was 2 or 3 years ago. Active Utilities sold, I think, 25% of their business to Macquarie, and Energy Trade was purchased by Quinbrook Infrastructure. So there's a big consolidation happening in the embedded network sector at the moment, probably due to some of the regulatory changes that are happening, but certainly it's been a money game in the past. So some of the losers in the embedded network sector, certainly distributors like Ausgrid and Endeavour Energy and Essential, probably less so Essential, less embedded networks out there, but certainly Ausgrid and Endeavour. This is just New South Wales, obviously, we're talking about. So we talked before about the example where there was 100 customers inside a building. Ausgrid would have supplied metering for those 100 customers, And they would have been billing those customers as, for the distribution component, as small market customers, through the energy retailer's bill. So now they're effectively getting revenue for that building for the same number of kilowatt hours going into the building at the gate meter, at the parent meter, as a large market customer, as opposed to 100 small market customers. So the distributors are losing revenue. Obviously, the energy retailers have greater competition through the introduction of embedded network operators. And I touched on Energy Australia and Origin Energy are now embedded network operators as well. Momentum Energy is an embedded network operator. So this, again, is not an exhaustive list of retailers, but just to give a sense of who the losers are. So to talk some positive stuff just for a moment, so some good outcomes can occur with embedded networks. So certainly when they've got an engaged embedded network operator, they're talking to the owners corporation, they're attending AGMs, they're providing reports, they've got good relationships, they're providing financial support, perhaps energy rebates on their bills. In the scenario of the service top water, obviously embedded network operator is managing that service top water, and if there's any equipment failure, they would fund that. The process of recovering the potable water, certainly in buildings, if you're owner occupier, it's going from your left pocket into your right pocket. But if you're a building where there's a lot of tenants in there, then the tenants would pay for the water they consume, and that would then go back to the owners corporations, reduce their levies. And of course, if you've got an embedded network operator supplying solar or batteries, or as the building starts to age, provide some funds to support with LED lighting upgrades or HVAC repairs, etc. Some significant support there. So another scenario which doesn't get spoken about very often, it's probably evolving now just purely to do with the evolution of the sector itself. And it's absolutely happening in Victoria now, probably less so in New South Wales, because Victoria is a bit more of a mature market. That was one of the questions, so we'll talk about that later as well. So there's an option for the owners corporation to manage the embedded network themselves. They take control, they put all the exemptions in their names, they engage a billing agent, a call center operator. They obviously need to make sure they're compliant, etc. There's risks involved with it as well, of course. They become financially liable then for the parent meter. Bad risk if tenants don't pay the bills, making sure they're compliant properly. So it's an option for them to do that. If it's managed well, they can make that profit, that arbitrage, and then either pump that money back into the building for upgrades or give significant discounts to the tenants in the building or to the residents in the building. So that's a scenario where it could win. And it is starting to play out now, and certainly in Victoria as well. So I want to just talk about a few solar examples. So I just reached out to some of the embedded network operators I know, and 4 of them were happy. I got 4 examples here. So there's no site-specific information, of course, but just in Liverpool. So all these are in New South Wales, where the embedded network operator has funded the installation of the solar at the time of construction. There's a site in Liverpool, 16 kilowatts. Here's another one in Meadowbank. It's another 35 kilowatts of solar. Seaforth is a smaller site, but still 13 kilowatts of solar. And this one's 95 kilowatts of solar, so a much larger one. So just 4 different examples of where the embedded network operators do provide solar to the building. And obviously from an environmental perspective, that's a good news story. We could talk commercially and functionally what that means. It could be a different discussion, but certainly from an environmental perspective, that's as I said, a good news story. So scenarios where the owners corporation aren't winning, and these are the ones where if anybody watched that video last night that Megan sent around, that certainly would trigger off those thoughts and conversations. So where the embedded network operator has to cough up the cash to fund all their investment in the building, higher energy costs than really may be needed, nominal or no discounting, and certainly I've seen scenarios of price gouging on the owners corporation's common area energy account, 40, 50, 60% above market. So that's I certainly advise people to either speak to the operator, their embedded network operator, or go to market. So profiteering for customers to have very little choice. I'm going to dig into the choice in a lot more detail in a few slides, so I haven't forgotten about that. We've got an embedded network operator just sitting there, sit and forget. It's not a good outcome, obviously, for the people, and it just makes people feel much more trapped in those sort of scenarios. So just to give you a couple case studies that I've seen in the past. So this is just common area load. I've got 3 different examples, 3 different buildings, small, medium, large, where the owners corporation has been way overcharged. For the larger building, like $30,000 a year, they've been overcharged compared to what they would have been able to get on a market price. And the owners corporation don't know, the strata managers don't know, and embedded networks are somewhat seen as a bit of a black box that, it's embedded network, we can't touch it, we can't get into it, it is what it is, and people just accept it. That's, as Megan said, I'm trying to tidy up the sector. These are the sort of things I just want to educate people to let them know what their options are. So first annual general meetings, and certainly the strata people in our session today would be all understand first annual general meetings. So you've got the scenario where it's 8:30 or 9 o'clock at night and you're up to agenda item number 24, and then someone puts an embedded network agreement in front of you with a hot water or solar purchasing agreement or centralised air conditioning billing, whatever the utility might be. The owners are a bit like deers in headlights. They've been there for 2 hours and exhausted. They just want to get the night over. So this is the scenario that's happening at the first annual general meetings. So I suspect in many cases the owners don't really even understand what it is. It might be their first exposure to embedded network. Should the owners engage an operator untried? And some agreements are 5, 10. I've actually seen a 20-year agreement, so 5 plus 5 plus 5 plus 5 with automatic rollovers. And certainly that's unreasonable to present that to people. But owners can seek advice, and this is what I'm trying to do again to educate people. Do owners have to pass the motion at the first AGM? And the answer is absolutely no. Absolutely no. The power won't be cut off on that night. It's not set and forget. You can't just don't sign an agreement and then do nothing about it. You must do it. I mentioned before the owners corporation own the embedded network, and they do. And as a result of that, there's some regulatory compliance requirements with the Australian Energy Regulator and certainly with the Ombudsman in New South Wales, all part of the obligations of owning the embedded network. And so you want to stop, catch your breath, take a back step, get some independent advice from regulators or just get some independent advice, negotiate the best outcome, for the owners corporation and for the occupants as well. The embedded network operators certainly won't be happy to hear what I've just said, but this is the scenario that you can certainly, as an option. So we started talking about choice before, and I'm going to dig into that a little bit more deeply now. First, talking about the owners corporation themselves, and then we'll go into individuals. So the owners corporations can change embedded network operators. You can change energy supply for your common area load. It is possible. It's been happening in Victoria for many years. It's starting to happen in New South Wales as well. So people, again, think this whole embedded network black box thing, it's not a black box. To state the obvious here, testing the market, for a better deal. A new and engaged embedded network operator will say, hey guys, we'll take over their site, we'll put some solar, we'll do this. It's obviously a great outcome for the owners corporations from a functional, commercial and environmental perspective. And to change embedded network operators is a very straightforward process. John, to your point before about buying out the infrastructure, whether it's embedded network electricity or embedded network centralised hot water, the owners corporations see this as a burden to pay out the capital. A new embedded network operator will pay for that capital. I have no doubt about that at all. If the contracts are unreasonable, then perhaps we would have to get some legal advice in relation to that. There may be a ACL issue, a consumer law issue in relation to the contract, but I'm not a lawyer, don't pretend to be, but we definitely need to get some advice in those scenarios. And it's just simple running an RFP process like you'd run a tender for energy supply, you run a tender for embedded network management services. And the cost of doing that is incidental compared to the benefits that can happen, that can be the outcome. And this is some case studies that I just wanted to run through very quickly now. I won't go through line by line, but again, 4 different types of buildings, different sizes. In those scenarios, some have hot water, some don't. In each site, the owners corporation are being overcharged, and the review I did on the residential rates were absolutely 10-15% above the market pricing as well. There was capital buyout in each of those scenarios, and with those scenarios, the embedded network operator would pay for the capital, and they would also install some solar as well. So this is the value proposition that owners corporations need to understand. It's not set and forget. It's not a black box. They own the building. They can take control. Whether they understand they can move tomorrow or might take 1 or 2 years because there's a notice period or whatever it might be, people can take control of their own buildings. So for existing sites for individuals now, we'll sort of go through that scenario a bit. We touched on before, get an energy only offer, get the energy retailer creates the NIMI through the embedded network manner, etc. But the residents have real choice. Yes or no. In reality, it's really, really difficult. While the rules exist for customers to be able to transfer out, and that was strengthened in December 2017 under the power of choice legislative changes, it's really, really difficult for people to churn in residential buildings. There's the biggest problem is actually finding an energy retailer that's prepared to go through the angst to transfer a customer across and go through that whole process. Certainly with commercial embedded networks like shopping centres, it's common practice. 20–30% of tenants inside the building can transfer out. If they have national chains or they want to consolidate their suppliers, it's a thing. It happens. But in residential buildings, it's very, very difficult. So certainly with centralised, no questions? No questions. So certainly with hot water, there's no choice for the individuals. Must buy from the incumbent. If you're not happy with that scenario, get some independent advice or go to the Ombudsman of New South Wales. They would certainly be able to provide some advice to individual residents.
Joseph, sorry, there are a couple of questions. Ethan and Asim, and John has a comment.
Okay, so let me click on those. Okay, John, Ethan. Okay, Ethan, how many of the ENPV systems are also supplying the tenancies additional to the common property? I'd say at the moment almost none, Ethan. Most of them would be supplying power to the common area only. In some scenarios, the power may be fed into the unmetered zone. And to preempt some of my later slides, I'll dig into that a bit more so you can upscale to solar. I'm very mindful of products like Illum Energy. I actually wrote an article about them last year. It's a great product, so we'll talk about that shortly as well. And then, so yes, so thanks, Ethan. That's a great question. So John's question was, no, all utility agreements except for residential electricity are limited to 3 years for strata schemes. Yeah, so that's an interesting comment with that. Certainly, I will talk about that later. This is one of the pre-asked questions, John. There's no limits in relation to that. Certainly not an interesting scenario, not a good option for the residents. I will talk about that more though later, John. What does utility cover? Hot water, lease hot water plant? Is that part of your question, John? Yeah, so utilities that I'm sort of focusing on today is centralised electricity, centralised hot water. We talked about the fibre to a degree, but that's really the limit of our conversation today. I'm mindful there are things like water filtration plants. We might have a 99-year lease. That's not a utility that I would focus on. Certainly lawyers like Bannerman's will be very vocal on those sort of things. When I did a presentation with the Bannerman's lawyers last year, he focused on those sort of things. So yeah, so my focus is sort of limited to those, John. Another question, is there a difference between embedded network, private? Is there a difference between embedded and private wire networks? I'd say Asim, I think it's the same thing. I would call that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the same.
We have a private wire network at the city at Green Square, Joseph, and I was just wondering if there any fundamental difference between embedded networks and private wire networks, or they're exactly the same thing.
Okay, so embedded network, as I sort of described in the first slide, has that sort of definition where it sits inside, but you might have other buildings where you might have, I don't know, a scenario like Property New South Wales, the government owns certain buildings where they have tenants inside their buildings. They're not sort of formally creating an embedded network because most of the tenants are all government tenants in any case, and they try to recover costs. But no, I would just classify as a embedded network as a private network. Yeah, maybe we can have a deeper discussion about this offline. Might be a chat over a coffee or something like that. So.
Just quickly, I think the city's embedded private wire is between multiple sites, so that's probably the difference.
Ah, okay. Yeah, there's something like that in North Sydney as well. Yeah, so it's I think one of there's a cogen plant in North Sydney that feeds the building next door too. So maybe that's what you're talking about.
Oh, good. Thank you.
So many questions coming through. So if a tenant is on market, child meter, what's the role of the EN operator for the tenant? So the only responsibility, or the network operator has the right to charge the tenant the physical distribution cost associated with the energy supply. So the relationship with the tenant still exists. They have the right to bill that tenant for the distribution charges. So that's the main relationship that they would still have.
So the energy charges are paid by the tenant directly to the retailer.
That's correct, yeah. So in those scenarios, many scenarios, it's a dual bill. I was going to say that quickly. So they've received one bill from the energy retailer with all the retailer type costs, and then the network distributor, the network operator, would charge for the physical distribution charges.
Right.
Certainly that's been addressed by the regulators, and to preempt that conversation, I'll touch on that shortly.
Thanks.
Another question, can you provide names of energy retailers that are happy to accept customers, like residential customers? I assume we're talking about Gordon, is that right? Yeah, I won't be able to put it. So like as rare as hen's teeth. Basically, it's almost, I did a ring around a couple of months ago and at the end of last year, and retailers just aren't interested. They're just not interested. Look, at the end of the day, there are energy retailers making margins of 30, 40, maybe $50 a year out of each residential customer, and the cost associated with all the manual processes to do this, it just makes that not appealing. You have to have automated B2B processes to make this work, and I absolutely going to be touching on those points when I talk about the key regulatory changes that are in the pipeline. So yeah, if you could find someone for me, then let me know, please. I think I had exposure once. I think Tango Energy was going to give an offer to someone, but I've heard in the past, I don't know if it ever came through, but all the major players just they don't do it. They just don't do it.
So really then for electricity in an apartment building, it's everybody's in or not. In reality.
In reality, yeah. So I guess that's my second sort of sense. Yeah, in reality, it's very difficult. Frankly, I should have probably said in reality it's impossible, but it's not impossible. It's just very, very difficult. So if you had a customer had an appetite to just really push it, and they had a big enough load, the penthouse on top of a building, if it's like a small business customer, and I've seen some residential loads that are 20 or 30 megawatt hours per annum, so huge. I don't know what they're running inside those apartments, but theoretically a retailer may be interested in that, but very, very, very rare. So look, frankly, in my dealings in the past, I've dealt with shopping centres that are embedded networks. As I said, 20 or 30% of those tenants will transfer out. There are some energy retailers that have put what I call a NUOS arrangement, like a network usage system arrangement with the embedded network operator to take the network charges for those tenants that go on market, and then the customer only ends up with one bill. But they're commercial customers in a shopping centre environment, not residential. Just mindful of time, so I'll just keep clicking through. So I'll touch on some of these things. If I miss anyone's questions not deep enough, feel free to reach out to me also after the session. So regulatory space. So at the moment, energy is being managed through an exemption framework. So the energy is on sold to customers through the exemption framework that Megan touched on before, the National Energy Customer Framework that sits within there. Or it is possible for customers to be sold energy to under an authorised framework. So that's like a normal retailer. Even though they're still off-market customers, they're sold energy to under an authorised retailer licence. The physical distribution of energy within inside the embedded networks is under an exempt framework. And that's basically saying that the owners corporation, as the embedded network owner, needs to function under that exempt framework as opposed to being an energy distributor like Ausgrid, and some of the obligations and requirements that are required from the Ausgrids of the world is not applied to the physical distribution of energy within a building. So I mentioned the term embedded network manager before. So that's not a shingle you put in your front door to say I'm managing this embedded network. It is an accredited market participant's role. They create the NIMIs for customers when they go on market. If a building for example, has more than 30 tenancies in the building, then an embedded manager must be appointed to the building. So it's a regulatory requirement for that to occur. So they create the NIMIs, they do all the NIMI management of the customer in MSATs. For example, when I was at Ausgrid in 2017, it would have been, we became an embedded network manager, and it's a whole process we had to go through with the Australian Energy Market Operator to get our authority to do that. So I mentioned before that billing must reflect market rules. Owners corporations must join the Ombudsman scheme. So this is a massive hole or anomaly, in the whole space of embedded networks. The embedded network operators are registering themselves with the Australian Energy Regulator as an exempt distributor. I understand that, and then either through their retail license or through their on-selling arrangements, they also register themselves with the Ombudsman, which are two requirements that have to be done. The owners corporations must also join must also register the embedded network as the embedded network owner. This is like for most cases with the Australian Energy Regulator, and they must register with the Ombudsman. And there would be dozens, if not hundreds, of cases where this is not the situation. Whenever I review a site, I provide a report to the owners corporation. I check the registrations. If they're not there, I tell them you're not registered. You are at risk of non-compliance. So power of choice must be offered to customers. So the embedded network operators, when they're selling the energy to the customers, they must have leased in their documentation, ideally verbally, but least in their documentation must say you do have options for power of choice. Regulators absolutely know the system's clunky and it's cumbersome, there's issues, they started to address it in 2017 and there's certainly more on the horizon. So this is a very controversial topic, so I'll see if there's probably going to be a whole raft of questions or points coming from this shortly. But certainly the Australian Energy Regulator has taken a formal position on the fact that they're aware that some developers are receiving payments from embedded network operators in order to get the rights to manage a building. We of course know at the first AGM, the embedded network operator gets engaged then, etc., but the angst potentially associated with that. We talked about that a little bit earlier, but the AER has a clear position on this. The developers must not. So theoretically, if the embedded network operator is giving funds to the embedded network manager is giving funds to the developer in order to get rights to manage the building, that's illegal. There's lots of ways around it. Capital contributions towards the main switchboard modifications of $100,000. Like I said, it's a $10,000 or $15,000 variation. Or the embedded network operator engages a third party embedded network manager who's not the embedded network manager as such. So therefore, the embedded network operator is not, the embedded manager is not giving funds. So yeah, this is a very controversial topic and a lot of it happens under the radar. So that's a lot of angst around that. I suspect there's going to be more coming to light for that in the next few years. So good news on the horizon, changes that are occurring. So as I said, the regulators have recognised it's clunky, it's a cumbersome system. So the Australian Energy Market Commission has undertaken a review. They published a report in 2019. It was updated, I think, in 2020, and they know it's cumbersome. There's lots of changes to increase customer protections, all the proposed changes. We're moving towards equal rights, equal protections for grid-connected customers to customers inside embedded networks. The competition, I talked about how difficult that is. They're going to remove those barriers. And the process to do that is through obviously new regulations, but also the introduction of new roles and market participants into the embedded network space to support this whole sort of regulatory environment and competition as well. So what's happening? So the embedded network exempt framework that sits under the NECF framework that we talked about before is migrating away from selling energy to customers under an exemption model to an authorised framework. So that authorised framework has multiple participants in there, and I'll talk about that in the next slide. So the distribution of energy is still going to be under an exempt framework. And you certainly don't need individual buildings to have the same obligations of Ausgrid. It just doesn't make any sense. So more protections for customers. Power of choice must be available, not just theoretically, but in actuality. So greater transparency. So there's a market definition called discoverability. in the market administration systems, which is MSATs that I touched on before. So at the moment, a customer rings up AGL, hi, I live at blah, 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 Smith Street in wherever, I'm in unit 4, I want to transfer out, and they're invisible. The customer can't be seen unless their NIMI is published in this market administration system. So one of the requirements, one of the recommendations of the AMC report is for all customers' NIMIs, the National Meter Identifier, to publish an MSATs from day one when the building goes live. Just to reiterate, billing must be obviously follow market protocols, but also other conditions as well, such as disconnection protections, payment programs, hardship policies, access to government services like concessions. At the moment, it's very difficult for concession people on a concession, pensioners, etc., that live in an embedded network to get access, direct access for the credits applied to their bill, like they would under a normal retail arrangement. It's an extra whole bunch of steps involved. Customers must have access to the Ombudsman, which I said before, but it's absolutely reiterating it. And the regulators are going to get some more enforceability. Basically, I've liaised with the Australian Energy Regulator, and there's certainly civil action that they could take against an embedded network if they were doing the wrong thing, but it's not an quick, easy fix for the regulators to get involved at the moment. So I touched on some of the new market roles that are going to be created. So at the moment, it's the exempt seller or an authorised seller selling inside the embedded network. So we will migrate away from the exempt seller requirements, and a new market role will be created called an authorised off-market retailer. Let me just to clarify, when I say will be created, it's the recommendations of the AEMC, which need to still go through a process of formalisation, of course. So the embedded network service provider term is off the news now, but that'll be upgraded to a more regulated position. The metering coordinator is the person who's responsible for installation of market meters now. So small market customers, the energy retailer engages their MC, and they then install the market metering. So all meters inside embedded networks going forward will be market meters. And Tonya, to your question, there'll be smart meters with remote read capabilities. And so metering won't need to be changed when a customer chooses to go on market. So I mentioned about the NIMIs being published in MSAT, so the customers are discoverable. No more dual bill scenarios. So the network charges, so NUOS stands for Network Use of System. So the procedures need to put in place with the embedded network operator to issue the distribution charges for the customers that go on market to the energy retailer of choice. So it's one bill, and it has to be through B2B market interfaces. There's no manual processes involved. When we get to that sort of territory, the customer can ring up, AGL or Origin or whoever. This is my NIMI, this is my site, I want to transfer out. They sign a contract, and bang, they're transferred through. It's all invisible to the customers inside the embedded network. So when is this all going to happen? So the regulators have been talking about this for a while. So they've said from the 1st of January 2020, any new embedded networks that went live from that date must comply from the start date. So any embedded networks that are existing, there'll be a compliance period of time before they need to comply. So Tonya, perhaps to sort of link to your question before, old meters will need to be replaced by smart meters over a period of time, but there will be some exemptions, potentially some grandfathering. I understand probably pre-2017 sites may be grandfathered, certainly for a period of time, but we need to wait for the new regulations to be published, then we'll get a much better sense of the obligations that will be, I'm going to say imposed on the market because it's disrupting the current scenario. So the new regulations will do that. So when is the start date? So the new rules are expected to be published last year. Didn't happen. Perhaps COVID sort of interfered with that. So it's still being reviewed. The effective start date was going to be the 1st of July this year. It's not happening as well. The latest I've heard is that Australian Energy Market Operator and now the regulators and COAG, the central government body, are all reviewing all these rules, and those meetings won't be occurring until probably Q3 next year, like calendar Q3 next year. So it'll be at least a 12-month notification period before the new rules go live. So maybe 2023 now, which is not imminent, but it's in the pipeline. So one of the questions, actually, before I go into brownfield conversions, are there any other questions there, Megan, that you need to answer?
Ethan has his hand up. Is that a legacy hand up? Ethan.
No? Okay. Well, if it is Ethan. Oh, yeah. So you had a question or was a legacy hand up? Okay, cool. All right, I'll continue. So one of the questions that was asked earlier was about brownfield conversions. So an existing building that's not an embedded network, can it be converted into an embedded network? So yes, it can occur. It can occur. There's a whole bunch of regulatory hoops that one needs to go through to make that happen. And there's different regulatory requirements for different segments of people within the building. So EIC is a market terminology for explicit informed consent in relation to signing up an energy account. So the Australian Energy Regulator requires 85% explicit informed consent of occupants inside the building. So we haven't talked about owners yet. We're talking about occupants, because when an embedded network is created, you're effectively terminating the relationship that person buying electricity has from their current supplier, whether it's the energy retailer relationship or the written, like the unseen but written physical connection relationship that person has with Ausgrid. You're terminating that relationship, so you need approval to do that. Then from a strata perspective, and there's probably more strata experts in this room than I, but from a strata perspective, a resolution would need to be passed through a motion that the owners of the building want to convert the building into embedded network. So not the occupants, but the actual owners. And I understand it's 75% in New South Wales, different rules in each states, but it's 75% of probably the people attending the general meeting are the ones that need to do that. So generally, you need really about 50 tenancies or so to make it commercially viable. It used to be about 100, but probably that line's dropped down a bit in the sand more recently. We'll see if that occurs. But they're a little bit rare as hen's teeth. You don't see very many residential brownfield conversions. You certainly need a very engaged owners corporation who want to do that. I'm going to explore that a bit further down the track, because there's one of the detailed questions about that as well, the predetermined Q&A. So there's half an hour to go. All right, I have to try to wrap up this section pretty quickly, Megan. So yes, you can do it. Why would you do it? All the same benefits that I mentioned in the earlier slides in relation to greenfield sites. Oh, cool. So Q&A time. It's almost exactly on time. That's perfect. All right, I'm going to take a breath and have a drink of water and just to see if anyone has any questions about my existing slides before I continue.
If I may, yeah, keep going.
Okay, cool. I will keep going then. So these are a whole bunch of questions that were emailed to me before for the next sort of 4 or 5 slides, and then I'll go through those now. So yeah, what are the implications in the OC? I'll read the questions first. What are the implications in the OC that are considering upgrades? Is there disincentive? Can embedded networks be integrated with solar? Are there any disincentives there? Examples and PPAs and stuff like that. So one thing I just really want to highlight, and I'm not saying this lightly, a building is a building. Everybody considers an embedded network to be a black box and no one wants to look inside the front door. But a building is a building. The owners corporation control their asset. Absolutely, whether there's an embedded network operator or not. And I had the same conversation yesterday with a facility manager. They own the building. They can do whatever they want. The embedded network contracts can't restrict what the operators want to do. So no disincentives for putting energy efficiency programs in there. You'll use less energy, so why not? We talked about solar. We gave all those examples before. So the question, are there disincentives? If the solar is fed 100% into the common area energy load, they just consume less energy. So there's no disincentive for that at all. And talked about examples. So now the last question, do consumers have the ability to purchase off-site green power, renewables, enter into PPAs, etc.? Along the lines of the theme of a building as a building, individual customers, residents can purchase green power. They go on market and buy energy from the energy retailer of choice, which is obviously difficult, but certainly the embedded network operator should be able to facilitate that if someone really wanted to pay the premium for green power. And certainly power purchase agreements can be established with the embedded network operator or independently. Go to a third party, get solar put on the roof, have the power fed into downstream of the common area meter. The owners corporation gets 100% of that benefit. They consume less energy and the owners corporation gets the full benefit of that. The embedded network operator just buys less energy at the parent meter and sells less energy to the owner's corporation. There's unlikely to be any sort of take or pay requirements associated with the common area energy account, but if there is, I would certainly want to challenge that. So next set of questions. Are embedded network operators obliged to provide visibility of energy consumption? If an OC were considering installing electric vehicle charging on the site, how they sort of manage that capacity, reporting to Ausgrid, and then Central Park in that example there. So no, first question, no. I'm not aware of any obligation to provide any energy monitoring at all. Not aware of that as well. Regarding electric vehicle charging, there's certainly many electric vehicle specialists that will come and determine the capacity of the building. I mentioned earlier as well that many embedded operators are happy to fund that sort of infrastructure. It's about putting load management software, and that's a whole other topic about this. I actually wrote an article about EV charging last year as well. It's in the Inside Strata magazine. So it certainly can be done, and whether it's embedded network or not, it doesn't need to be specifically managed through the embedded network operator. Not aware of any requirement to pass on any emissions data to Ausgrid at all. And regarding neighbours, I'm not a neighbours specialist, and so I didn't really know the answer to this question. I know, Ethan, you're in the audience there. I think you're a neighbours specialist. So did you want to make any comments about that for Central Park at all? I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, look. Sorry, I'm getting a bit clear on headphones. The main reason for the issue there with Central Park was just they had central thermal metering. Centralized thermal. So there's a central thermal plant that provided hot and chilled water from the plant into the building, or into several buildings there. And there was just no metering of that anywhere at the boundary to the building, so it was impossible to work out the heat loads that were actually going into the building. I feel like there was probably there were sort of thermal meters around the place, but it was kind of impossible to access them, access the data from them. So that was probably the main issue with that site. And I think that's probably pretty rare. I don't know that there'd be that many buildings around the place that have a central thermal plant outside the building that's supplying hot and chilled water to the building. What is going on here?
I'm sorry, Joseph, you're on mute.
Sorry how I did that. So that was very clever of me, wasn't it? Yes, it's an interesting scenario with that building there. I think those meters that are actually installed, there aren't market meters as well. So I don't think people could ever transfer out in that building unless they're retrofitted. I think it's single disc. That's DIN rail meters, I think, from memory. So anyway, I'll continue. Thank you, Ethan.
Yeah. Well, just one other thing to just add on the neighbours thing. Where there's centralised hot water and it's not metered at all, that's problematic, I guess, for neighbours as well, because under a normal neighbours model, you can exclude any energy that is for in-apartment use. So if you've only got one volume boundary meter for gas, and that supplies all the tenancies' cooktops and also the domestic hot water system for those tenancies, then you should be able to exclude those as long as there's no common property connections to it. But if you've got a pool heater or something like that running off that and it's not sub-metered, or you've got some common property connections to the domestic hot water system that should be included in the neighbours rating, then that becomes problematic as well.
Certainly, if the developers are advised of this when they're when they're designing the building, when the architects and all the electrical people get involved, if it's more metering is better than less metering, and I agree with that. And if the neighbours' requirements up the ante on that, then developers and builders will have to build it in a compliant manner right from the start. So mindful of the time, so I'll just continue on. So this is a very controversial topic, and John, thank you for highlighting that in your pre-questions. In relation to the Strata Schemes Act, there were some changes to the Strata Scheme Act that excluded embedded networks specifically. And it was quite extraordinary when that was published to see when that happened a couple of years ago. But just for everyone's reference, this is the extract out of the Strata Schemes Act. And excuse me, one of John's questions earlier was in relation to limits on 3-year contracts for the supply of electricity to common area agreements for common area load. And yes, there are those sort of limitations there. You know, any agreements pre-first AGM must end at the date of the first AGM. You know, new agreements are entered into, they're all capped at 3 years. All these sort of scenarios are occurring. The bottom section that's highlighted there, section 4, specifically excluded embedded networks from the review that the Strata Schemed Management Act put forward on the new rules. And you sort of start scratching your head and you wonder why. And I was doing some research to try to work out what that answer might be. And this is a bit of a soft answer, but I think it's the only answer that I have, excuse me, at the moment. So I was looking through some documentations from up on the right-hand side of my screen there. It's a statutory review by the state government in relation to that. And the bottom section that's highlighted there, that they said that the embedded networks were exempted because they're aware that the AEMC was undertaking a review. The new rules will be published eventually. They didn't want to preempt any findings or change any direction. So that's the only thing that I can find that would indicate why they ignore that. Again, if you look at the market rules academically or literally, people can transfer out. So perhaps they were looking at it from a pragmatic perspective without understanding some of the limitations or the people within inside. So at the moment, there's no limit on how long an embedded network contract, management contract, can be signed by the owners corporation. So yes, that's not necessarily the best answer, John, but it's the answer, the only answer I can think of.
But that's for electricity, residential electricity, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, this is all about electricity.
This just for clarity, with everybody else, we are talking purely about electricity embedded network contracts here. Otherwise, other embedded network contracts would be subject to the 3-year limitation, wouldn't they?
Except hot water is, you'll see minimum 10-year contracts for serviced hot water.
How does that escape the provisions
here? Yeah.
How does hot water escape? My reading of it is all utilities. Are they saying hot water is not a utility?
Well, they're saying hot water is an embedded network. So if you just go like through point 4 through embedded network, so they would just classify centralized hot water as an embedded network.
But I think I don't want to get into too much of a debate about this, but I think point 4 actually only talks about electricity supply.
Oh yes, yeah, you're right. Yeah, you did say that. Yes, yes.
Not a general point around embedded networks. The general points are made in clauses 1 to 3 there, which appear to limit embedded network agreements generally to 3 years and termination at the end of the first AGM, with the outlier being electricity embedded networks. And
yes,
you have shed some light on perhaps the thinking behind that. I'm just wondering, going forward, how long are we going to be stuck with that extra section? Those new regulations you talked about earlier, hopefully the thinking must be that somehow those new regulations are going to fix up the electricity distribution to a level where owners corporations do not have to be protected.
Yeah, you would, yeah, I don't know. I can't answer the thinking that went behind the question, apart from what I was able to determine. But yeah, and the new regulations will certainly create more competition, more contestability inside embedded networks. So if people can just buy energy from whoever they want, they're almost invisible to the fact that they are inside an embedded network. So when those rules come about in 2023 or whenever we see that, that'll, you know, inverted commas, people that need rescuing, who feel like they're trapped, that they'll have that opportunity. Unless energy retailers in the short term want to get on board with that program and become a champion in that space and say, look, we'll target anyone inside an embedded network and we'll go through that process. You might have to find a smaller, more dynamic energy retailers to do that rather than the large, big clunky ones that have got very archaic sort of processes. Yeah, I'm not really answering your question satisfactorily, John, but I can confirm, hot water embedded networks, it's 10-year contracts. There's an opportunity to terminate the hot water contracts, so perhaps the writers of the Act were aware of that. So the OC can terminate it at any time, and for the most part, it's termination for convenience. They just got to pay out the capital. That gets obviously into a significant debate about why did the developer do that, etc., which probably could segue into the next set of slides, unless you had any other questions, John.
That's actually a nice segue into, sorry, John, into Jens's question above. Can you see that?
So where in the piece does a developer decide to go embedded network? No OC has been formed, with the decision made. It's convincible the decision was made late in the piece. Okay, so the developer normally talks to the embedded network operators when it's still a hole in the ground, before construction started. Certainly at the very early stages of construction, embedded network can still be contemplated at that point. Basically up until the main switchboard is constructed, you need additional infrastructure on this, such as the CT chamber to hold the parent meter. So up until that point, it can become an embedded network. But often conversations are had with the developer, 1 or 2 years before the buildings are even sold. So very early in the piece.
So then, can you hear me? Sorry.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah. I think so. Sorry, Joseph. So it can be made up to that point, but the owners corporation hasn't really been formed at that point yet. And so if you are going to be an owner in that building, you'd have to be aware of it being an embedded network, and then it's up to you whether you want to live there or not. It's not something where an owner is going to be involved in making that decision.
Okay, this is a perfect question for my next slide. So that's, but just to answer your question first, no, that's right. The OC is not formed. The OC doesn't get formed until the inaugural general meeting. Then at that point, the developer would have a 100% ownership of the building and a relationship with the embedded network operator as an on-seller. In New South Wales, that agreement terminates at the first AGM if there was a formal agreement in place, and then a new agreement has to come in place for the first at the first AGM for the owners corporation. So this is a great question. I love it. So it's just to consider whether there's adequate disclosure to the buyers of apartments of existing embedded networks and the costs and restrictions that are imposed. So disclosure rules are different in different states. Absolutely. There's no consistent approach. New South Wales, you rock up the first AGM or 2 weeks before you get your documents, go, it's a what? In Queensland, there's disclosure. In Victoria, the developer at the inaugural general meeting signs a 10-year management contract. That then gets novated across to the OC at the first AGM. And so they rock up and go, what? I'm here for 10 years. There's not even any choice at the first AGM. So different rules in each state. So given the requirements, John asked me earlier about my opinion. So my personal opinion is no. There's not enough disclosures. There should be more disclosures. And to put myself on the line, my professional opinion is no. There's not enough disclosures. Developers should disclose the existence of embedded network to potential buyers. And obviously down the track, then those owners need to declare that to occupants that are renting from them. There should be open and transparent process about disclosure. Full stop. I don't think it's not a debate. It's full stop. It just should be that.
There are some really ugly examples out there, isn't there? Where if I wasn't aware of the embedded networks, that I could be buying an apartment in a development, and there's one that I have in mind, and then I would get the first bill for the levies, and I wouldn't know what was happening to me. It's really ugly.
Yeah, no, absolutely. People just don't know. If you move in, if you're one of the early movers before the first AGM, you might start to work it out when you ring up AGL and try to get your power. I keep saying AGL, but any retailer, and get your power connected. It's a much harder process, or it doesn't happen. Or if you haven't moved in yet, 2 or 3 weeks, whenever the requirements are to get all the documentation for the first AGM, you then got this 90-page document of which 20 pages is all about embedded networks, and that's the first time. No, you're right. People just, it's this is why I want to try and tidy up the industry, because there are some scenarios where you can actually have a good outcome, with the embedded networks. Certainly there's less choice at the moment, and that's being addressed, but there are some scenarios where you can have some good outcomes. And I touched on some of those examples.
100%. Yeah, I've seen some good examples for sure. Yeah.
And this sort of leads into the next line of sort of questioning as well. I'm just going to go a bit quickly through these. So, okay, so embedded networks keep coming up. This is a question for someone in council about embedded networks, case studies, etc. So earlier on, I talked about some embedded networks. Generally, they're no smaller than 50 lots. There are some exceptions, but not at all. Certainly, the AEMC is starting to address some of the regulatory issues, and we talked about that before, and disclosures certainly talked about that too. Just focusing now on the second question here about metering. So up until the 1st of December 2017, the metering had to be market metering, but you're talking $500–600 a year to put in a smart meter, type 4, smart meter in order for a tenant to or customer inside an embedded network to transfer out. When power of choice metering came about, single phase smart meters, now the retailers are paying anywhere from $60 to $100 a year to the metering coordinator or the meter provider to facilitate metering. It's not a major obstacle anymore in relation to from a cost perspective. The main issue, because the energy retailers pay for metering now, that's under the power of choice metering changes that occurred in 2017. The retailer now pays for smart metering for even residential customers. So the main issue again is finding a retailer that has an appetite to want to do this and actually, to start targeting some customers there. Had some good conversations with retailers. They would like to do it. The processes just can't. The process just can't do it. So, what's the possibility of embedded networks to work collectively to benefit the residents? For example, we talked about Illume Energy before. So, absolutely, yes, it's possible. You need an engaged owners corporation. It's hard enough to get approval to decide what colour paint, you paint the front door if it's got a crack in it, let alone getting everybody on this board with the same program to make a common decision. It's absolutely possible. And in relation to Illume Energy, I met the guys a year or so ago. The great innovation, and anyone who doesn't know about that, you can now install solar on the roof of an apartment, and through their, so it's called Soul Share device, the energy can be fed downstream of individual meters now, not just one lot of power to the common area. You can have, I think off each device is 30, I think, individual single phase meters. I can't remember the exact number. So you have, one device, individual departments are all getting the power, and they've got software that manages the equal distribution of power to each individual customer's lot. So Illume Energy can work with an embedded network. Illume Energy can work without an embedded network. You don't need to have an embedded network, but that's certainly fantastic. But again, you need to have an engaged committee, and you need to have an engaged owners corporation committee. So which leads on to my next point about how is it possible to sort of get better value out of the embedded network from an OC's perspective. This question is about developing PPAs and what are the options for all that. And certainly, if the embedded network operator is not on board with the program, there's an option to go with the self-managed model. And I talked about that before, where the owners corporation is managing the embedded network themselves, so they can upscale the power, work out how they're going to allocate the energy to the individuals, whether it's through technology such as Illume, or everybody gets in the building like say it works out to average of $50 per apartment worth of value of green energy. Everybody gets a $50 credit annually on their bill, whatever the process might be. So rather than doing it through a third party, the owners corporation could certainly do it themselves. Or if they wanted to, you can certainly do it through a third party, whether it's an embedded network or not. Again, mindful of my point before, an embedded network, a building is a building. You can facilitate all these things. So let me just run through the scenario of the embedded network where the owners corporation can do it themselves. So solar in a building, the traditional supply, it's a small or scaled solar supply to the common area load that's suitable for the energy that's needed for that particular. If there's any excess energy, there might be option to export the energy through some sort of feed-in tariff, but the feed-in tariffs aren't necessarily good value for money at the moment. So if you install the solar let's call it at the parent meter, it's actually downstream in the parent meter, but upstream of all the child meters, including the common area meter as well. So the scale can be upsized to meet the whole building's needs. And then how that value is then allocated to each individual residence, it's through a technical solution like Illume Energy, or it can just be, as I said, allocation of value to residents within the building. But you need an absolutely engaged Owners Corporation Committee to get involved with those sort of discussions. But you think about from an environmental perspective, feeding solar to the whole building as opposed to feeding solar just into the common area load. It's obviously a good environmental outcome. So just very quickly, this could be a half an hour in itself, but just very quickly, I think John or maybe Fred asked me about the Victorian government. There's a ban in Victoria for new embedded networks, or an election promise in any case. So I'm just going to break this question down into two sections. So firstly, the Victorian environment. I mentioned before, no disclosures in Victoria, and 10-year agreements are being novated over to the Owners Corporation committees. No disclosures. It's significantly harder for people in Victoria to transfer out of the embedded network, because despite the power of choice metering rules that occurred in 2017, Victoria has a derogation. They can separate themselves away from that. The market, though, is more mature in Victoria. We're starting to see supply churn from one embedded network operator to another. And the reason why they're a bit more complex in Victoria, they're not following all the rules of NECF, the National Energy Customer Framework. They operate under the Essential Services Commission and something called the General Exemption Order. So they sort of have to register the embedded networks from a distribution perspective with the AER, but from an on-selling perspective, there's no requirement for them to do that. That's covered under the Essential Services Commission. As I said, very quickly, I'm touching on that point. That's a whole topic in itself. And just on this a review from the Department of Environment, Land and Water and Planning that's happening, or just sort of happening at the moment in Victoria. In 2018, a politician moved into a building and they said, what, embedded network? What? I can't buy energy here. I'm going to ban all embedded networks. That's literally how this whole thing triggered from that. So an election promise, we will ban all new embedded networks unless there's a microgrid associated with it that's generating energy. So then this review paper just came about. It's just actually lodged last Friday. There's first submissions went in to say, oh, well, how do you do this? How are we going to implement it? What's a microgrid? What's the definition of a microgrid? What does renewable energy mean? Now, all these questions are raised and thrown to the market because you've got a politician that said X, this is going to happen. Then you've got the real world and people now have to make this happen. So there's a submission that the government has put forward to interested parties, ranging from advocacy groups wanting to support the ban through to embedded network operators that obviously don't want to support the ban. So it'll be interesting to see how that sort of evolves. But the final submission was issued last week. Some of the main points is that just leave them there and adopt the recommendations to the AEMC. Make metering contestable. All these sort of dynamics are being discussed in the submissions. A draft report's going to be issued by the government in the middle of the year, and we would expect to see a final report at the end of this year. So everyone's got their eyes, or everyone like me who's interested, have got their eyes on Victoria at the moment. And thank you, Fred. I think it's Fred to issuing that question. So summary points very quickly. Time. So developers can differentiate themselves. They can be good outcomes, but we know they can be positive or negative outcomes for the Owners Corporation. And frankly, probably you would hear about more negative outcomes than the positive outcomes, just the way it is at the moment. Not set and forget. People shouldn't just go, oh crap, excuse my language, oh dear, this is an embedded network, it's a black box, I can't do anything about it, I'll just suck it up. It's not the case. Whether it's an individual going to the Ombudsman or the Owners Corporation wanting to change operators, it's not set and forget. We talked about brownfield conversions being possible. It is a great opportunity to upsize sustainability measures. And the OCs just have to seek support and don't just take it. Seek support, go to regulators, go to the Ombudsman, get independent advice, etc. So, and I guess the final point, there are significant rules on the horizon which should support customers' rights. So any more questions? This is like exactly 12:30. It's almost like I planned it.
we may leave the questions for there, just so people can get out of here on time. Yeah, okay. Joseph has been incredibly generous with his time, and I'm sure you'll agree that his breadth and depth of knowledge is absolutely outstanding. I just have a couple more slides.
Well, let me cancel my screen share.
Okay.
I should be off now.
And more actions. Open share tray. There we go. Cross my fingers. There we go. And it's frozen. Oh dear. Yeah. Okay, so sorry, my computer's moving a bit slow. Joseph will be delivering a variation of this presentation on the 31st of March through the Owners Corporation Network, and that's a fantastic opportunity for him to be in front of end consumers. We're very happy about that. He is doing that pro bono, so thank you, Joseph, for doing that. Anyone can register for that. Only members will have access to the replay of it. And there is a link in the chat feed just to provide some feedback on today's training session. So a huge thank you, and I'm quite astounded by the sophistication of the questions that have been asked as well. And I think if anyone wanted to stay online that had an unanswered question, we could probably keep the door open for another 8 minutes or so. Otherwise, thank you for coming, and please provide your feedback. And thank you again, Joseph.
You're very welcome. Thank you very much for your time today. Much appreciated. Big commitment, I understand that. And I will hang around for any other questions. I think I might have missed a few questions at the end there as well, so please email me if I didn't catch them.
Joseph, can I ask you another question?
Sure.
Just towards the end there, you were in your summary, you were indicating that there's flexibility there for an owners corporation who's got an embedded network provider to make changes, or if the provider's terms are not satisfactory. Where would an owners corporation go looking to find a selection, a choice of embedded network providers?
Okay, great question. So I'll answer the question the first way in a self-serving manner. Obviously, to approach independent consultants like me, and I have no association with any one provider. No, like I don't operate on commissions. I do everything for service to maintain my independence. Yes, so I would certainly know all the right providers. The alternative would be to do a search, online, embedded network operators. You can go there or look on the Australian Energy Regulator's website for registered embedded network managers, accredited. Some of them are also embedded network operators as well. It's certainly that would probably be the best starting points. But there's not a yellow pages shopping list of all operators in Australia. You have to sort of do a bit of research with that.
Those embedded network operators, do they typically just deal with a single utility, or would there be an operator that would deal with multiple utilities like internet, electricity, water reticulation?
Multiple, excluding the water reticulation. So electricity, absolutely. Centralized hot water and associated gas. Often the embedded network operators are now funding the infrastructure for the fibre as an incentive to get that developer on board, even though they don't really have any play in it going forwards necessarily. They just will fund that as an incentive. Some of the embedded network operators will have associations with internet service providers as well. So that's probably more of a rarity. But the water filtration systems, that might be a council requirement. Embedded network operators wouldn't be involved with that. Well, not at this stage.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay. So any other questions? Nicole, are you still online, Nicole? I saw you asked the question before. I didn't get a chance to answer it. I might email everybody with my contact details so they can.
Nicola isn't still online. And sorry if I missed it, Joseph. Did you answer the question about have you got any examples of people undoing an embedded network and going conventional?
Did I miss that question? No. Okay, so that's.
It was part of Jens's question, and also Ethan had one around the disincentives that for reducing energy. That's in the chat feed as well. A contractual issue.
I talked to the disincentives. No disincentive, just use less energy. So I think that was when I mentioned, I think there's no take or pay requirements, like minimum bill requirements for energy users for the owners corporation. The embedded network operator wouldn't do that as part of a supply contract. Regarding retrofitting an existing embedded network back to a non-embedded network. So I think I'm not sure if I answered that question in my comments, but if I did and I missed it, I apologize. But to talk through that now, theoretically, so let's talk about electricity now. Theoretically, you could remove the parent meter, remove all the private metering, install market metering for every customer inside the embedded network, including the owners corporation's common area load, and it becomes a market site. It becomes a non-embedded network. So there might be some infrastructure costs associated with wiring, just to make sure this main switchboard is still safe. I don't think it's an insurmountable cost. It's just a cost. The owners corporation would obviously want to have to do that. I think the biggest challenge would actually be the network providers then having to effectively take responsibility back for the site, not just at the parent connection point, but downstream. So NIMIs would need to be created for all individual customers. If the NIMIs were already published in the market administration system called MSATs, the embedded network operators have been allocated a selection of NIMIs that are EN NIMIs. They start with a 7, as opposed to New South Wales, it normally starts with an N or a 4, the National Meter Identifier. Embedded network NIMIs start with a 7. And so if all those NIMIs have been published, for Unit 1, number 1 Smith Street as NIMI 7, blah, 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 that NIMI now needs to be made extinct in the MSATs, and a new NIMI would need to be created. If there was no NIMI there already, then that process would be slightly less. So we're sort of going down the point of the authorities, the energy authorities, like they'll sort of go like this. Oh crap! How do we do this? So it's sort of the process can theoretically occur, but I haven't actually seen any examples where it's been undone. I'd be really intrigued to get involved with that one day, just to sort of walk through the process. So I have very little in my life. I enjoy this sort of thing, but it'd be really interesting to see what it would actually look like going through that process to undo something. Frankly, in my last role, I was involved with the building. It wasn't an embedded network. The NIMIs had all been published and the building was live. I was in the strata, energy strata sector. And the strata manager came to us and said, all the units have been changed. Like it was like unit 1, 2, 3, shop 1, 2, 3, unit 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever, up to 100 or whatever it was. The council came back and said, it's now unit 1, 2, 3, shop 1, 2, 3, then unit 4, 5, 6, 7. So unit 1, 2, 3 disappeared. So from an address point of view in MSATs, NIMIs have been allocated to all these customers. So from that point onwards, all the NIMIs are out by 3 because the council had said X, but Ausgrid had done Y. And so it was a 6-month process just to find out through Ausgrid and the meter provider, just to work out what to do. And then the strata manager said, oh, great, thank you, we're all resolved. I said, no, this is just starting. We've fixed what we had to do in the background. Now, all the energy, because it's not one energy retailer for the whole building, it could be like 15 different energy retailers. So every energy retailer would have to go in, talk to the customer, change their NIMI, retrospectively do this, reverse bills, rebuild. So I said, this is a nightmare now. I can't. We've finished what we can do now. The market now just has to settle. So yeah, so it's a clunky process for those things to occur. But I saw you smile there before, Gordon. But I'd love to get involved with a building like that, just to ride the wave and see where it comes out at the other end. So. Sorry, any other questions?
If we have time for another question, if I may, so Jens, Energy Conservation, I was just early on, I wrote down a few thoughts on a development which was, and I want to emphasize again, I've seen some very good examples of embedded networks, but it's sort of the ugly one that really made a lasting impression. A development that went with Point, where really one of the largest energy retailers is the operator of an embedded network, and it's the common property central services, common property consumption and central services that combined, I think it used about between 1 and 2 gigawatt hours per year. So by all stretches, a large market user, and they had a contract with this retailer. They paid 23 cents per kilowatt hour flat across all time periods. No access to peak, no access to shoulder, no access to off peak. I'm not against earning money, but that just the morality seems absent there. And what I wanted to ask you is that a price gouging exercise, or is that the investment was just so great and we have to recoup that? I mean, I find it hard to see.
Yeah. It's frankly, in my view, a combination of both. It's absolute. I've seen price gouging, and 23 cents is at the lower end of the gouging. I've seen 29, 30, 31 cents weighted delivered price. Because on top of that energy charge, you're talking there's a daily fee as well, but like 80 or 90 cents a day or whatever it is for the individual residents. So if you've got 200 or 300 residents as well, that cost needs to be also weighted into the gouging too. But common area, it's not. But 2 gigawatt hours per annum, as you said, it's 20 times the size of a large market customer. If they were on market, they'd be on unbundled pricing. They're probably closer to, and depending on the end, I mean, obviously know how energy markets work, and the commodity prices, go up and down all over the place. And I've seen them 17 cents and 2 cents per peak, in the last 20 years. So, you could be paying a weighted price maybe of 18, 19 cents, delivered price as opposed to 23 cents. So what's that, 20% above market? Again, those 3 or 4 examples I used weren't just sort of dummy numbers that I pulled out. They were numbers that I've seen people being absolutely gouged. And at least 50% of the embedded networks, and I reviewed 70 or 80 embedded networks last year, 50% of them were gouging. Absolutely gouging. And part of the gouging is to make profit, and part of the gouging is because it's a limited audience now. The developers are getting value out of it that should be going back to the building. And so it's either ongoing or it's either been done up front. And so the operators need to get money back. So it's a combination of those 2 things. I've seen fantastic examples where I've stood at a first AGM where the embedded network operator, where the owners corporation, sorry, I'm getting tired, jump back at the developer, they said, when this goes live, these are some of the conditions we want as part of your management agreement with that site. One of those conditions includes a $20,000 a year rebate that you will give the owners corporation, onto their common area energy account. So you can imagine standing up in front of a crowd, at the first AGM saying, well, we're going to give you $20,000 a year credit as well. It's a great conversation. And by the way, as a large market customer, if you want to transfer out, you can transfer out if you actually don't want to buy energy from us. So the company I was involved with, Embedded Networks, that's what we did. We provided unbundled billing for large market customers. We provided bundled billing with a 20 or 30% discount for small market customers, open and transparent, all the way through. Honestly, like Megan said it at the beginning, and it's not a cliche, absolutely the reason why I started my own business to get involved with this, what I'm doing now, is to help tidy up the sector. I'm involved with the Energy Charter as well. I'm a council member of the Code of Conduct Council. I was appointed that at the end of last year. I want to do what I can to tidy up the sector. I need to make a business out of it so I can pay my own bills too. But I want to tidy up the market sector. And I've got 20 years of experience, and I have no agenda apart from just wanting to make things better. And that's my whole focus. Sounds like an airy-fairy thing, but that's absolutely what I want to do. A very supportive wife, so that's good. While I'm building my business, it's good.
Thanks, Joseph. We might leave it there. Thank you so incredibly much. A couple more questions have come